Afternoon, everybody, and good morning, depending on where you are in the world. We'll just wait about a minute for people to join because we've just opened the webinar and then we will kick off. So if you just give us exactly 1 minute, we will start then. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Stephen Grusd, and I am a program head at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg. We are delighted to be having this webinar on nuclear energy in times of war, a very important topic, a very timely subject of discussion. This is being hosted by the South African Institute of International Affairs, SIA, and we will tell you about the other partners on the project after my remarks. So we gathered today at a moment when the intersection of warfare and nuclear infrastructure is no longer a theoretical concern. It is a lived reality, and it is accelerating. The occupation and repeated attacks on the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant in Ukraine, Europe's largest nuclear facility, have forced the world to confront a deeply troubling gap in our global governance architecture. To answer the question, what happens when nuclear installations become military targets? But Ukraine is not an isolated case. Rising tensions between Israel and Iran have brought new and alarming dimensions to this question. Iran's nuclear facilities, including those at Natanz and Fordo, have been the subject of repeated speculation, threat, and in some instances, direct action, both in June last year and at the very moment with attacks from the US and Israel. And Israel itself, a state with undeclared nuclear capabilities, operates in one of the world's most volatile security environments. The prospect of nuclear installations being drawn into that conflict is no longer unthinkable. Taken together, these situations paint a disturbing picture. We are entering an era in which nuclear facilities are increasingly viewed not as protected civilian infrastructure, but as strategic targets or instruments of leverage in armed conflict. The risks are not abstract. A serious nuclear incident at a plant caught in the crossfire, whether through direct attack, sabotage, or the disruption of safety systems, would know no borders. I'm old enough to remember Chernobyl from 1986 when I was a schoolboy, and I was much further away from it than some of our speakers. But the horror with which that was greeted, and that was probably on a small scale. The humanitarian, environmental, and geopolitical consequences would be felt beyond the immediate theater of war, including here on the African continent. And yet, Africa is not merely a bystander in this conversation. Africa has a proud and pioneering legacy in nuclear non-proliferation. The African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty, or the Pelindaba Treaty, explicitly prohibits armed attacks on nuclear installations under Article 11. That foresight was remarkable. The question we must now ask is whether the international community has the political will to match Africa's ambition, and whether Africa can once again lead the way in strengthening the international frameworks we so urgently need. Today, we'll hear in-depth analysis of the Zaporizhzhya case and the role of international sanctions and the broader regulatory gaps that current conflicts have so starkly exposed. We are also delighted to be launching a paper that offers concrete recommendations for strengthening international mechanisms to protect nuclear facilities during armed conflict. The name of this paper is Enhancing Nuclear Safety, Protecting Nuclear Power Plants Against Military Threats, and it analyzes the occupation of and attacks against the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant in Ukraine and the complex risks posed to nuclear safety and security in contemporary armed conflict. Based on this assessment, the document identifies key areas where regulation should be strengthened to enhance nuclear safety and security across the African continent. The report was also presented in Addis Ababa in January this year and has been developed through a partnership between South African and Ukrainian experts from SIA, the Ilok Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation, the Ukrainian Association of South Africa, and the Dixie Group, along with support from the Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation. It draws upon a different policy brief entitled Nuclear Safety During the Military Invasion, a case study of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which was presented in 2024 at the African Union Mid-Year Coordination Meeting in Accra, Ghana. Elements of that brief have been refined, expanded, and incorporated into the present analysis, and all information in this document is current as of June 2025. I'm deeply grateful to our distinguished speakers for bringing their expertise to this conversation, spanning international law, nuclear governance, African diplomacy, and frontline experience of Ukraine itself. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, researcher Isabel Bosman-Burnett, who will begin with the presentations. Isabel.
Thank you so much, Steve, for welcoming our participants, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm just trying to make this a little bit bigger. But of course, it is not letting me do that. So you'll just have to view it as is. Apologies for that. So my section of today's discussion will be speaking to international and African frameworks for regulating and responding to the military invasion of nuclear facilities. And I hope that sets a foundation for the presentations that will follow after me, especially as it links to the paper that we will be launching and that I was happy to work on with my co-authors Zvenka and Olena present in today's discussion as well. So what I will focus on briefly is firstly terminology, two issues: nuclear safety, nuclear security, to identify exactly what those mean so that we understand the broader context of what is happening now, especially in the context of Zaporizhzhya, but as Steve mentioned, also the nuclear facilities currently under attack in Iran and Israel as well. Then I'll be looking at the international legal framework, distinguishing between what we have or do not have rather in treaty law, what we do have in customary law, and then what's been coming out of the IAEA General Conferences and IAEA's response to Zaporizhzhya. And then most importantly, Africa's commitment to peaceful uses and the African legal framework for ensuring nuclear safety and security, which is very instructive in the current moment. So on the issues of terminology, I draw there on the definitions used by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, which defines nuclear safety as the achievement of proper operating conditions, prevention of accidents and mitigation of accident consequences, resulting in protection of workers, the public, and the environment from undue radiation risks. And then very importantly, the way it sees nuclear security, the prevention and detection of and response to criminal or intentional unauthorized acts involving or directed at nuclear material, other radioactive material, associated facilities, or associated activities. So if we look at international law and the protection of nuclear installations, we find that nuclear installations are not protected under international treaty law. Customary law is the stronger part in this instance rather than treaty law. So what we do have in customary law are two additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and then the rules of international humanitarian law. So precisely because there's no multilateral international treaty for protecting nuclear installations in armed conflict, customary law carries more weight. And you can read more about that in a previous paper of mine, which is available on the SIA website. So looking just quickly at what that entails. So firstly, rule number 42 of the Rules of International Humanitarian Law says specifically that particular care must be taken if works or installations containing dangerous forces, namely dams, dikes, and nuclear electrical generating stations, and other installations located at or in their vicinity are attacked in order to avoid the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. Then Article 15 of Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions and Article 56(1) of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. The text reads the same. They both say that works or installations containing dangerous forces, namely dams, dikes, and nuclear electrical generating stations, shall not be made the object of attack, even where these objects are military objectives, if such an attack may cause the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. Other military objectives located at or in the vicinity of these works or installations shall not be made the object of attack if such attack may cause the release of dangerous forces from the works or installations and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. Now, the problem here is one of interpretation, because it says if such an attack may cause the release of dangerous forces. The question then becomes in whose assessment? But the point remains that these installations should be completely off the table. They should not be attacked. The risks are simply too high. Also important to consider is the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, or the CPPNM. So it has been argued that this convention is limited in scope because it does not apply to nuclear materials used for military purposes or to those used for peaceful purposes, but not in international transport. But the text of the convention does go on to say that with the exception of Articles 3 and 4 and paragraph 3 of Article 5, the convention shall also apply to nuclear material used for peaceful purposes while in domestic use, storage, and transport. So responsibility for ensuring protection of nuclear material is also primarily domestic under the convention, but its amendment does seek to establish greater international cooperation in the interest of nuclear safety and security. Then just looking briefly at what the IAEA has done in the specific context of the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, but also Chernobyl, which has also been occupied during the war in Ukraine. And then, of course, we also see updates now from the IAEA on the situation in Iran. So we've seen several statements, emergency meetings, and reports on the situations on the ground, both at Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhya. The Director General, Mariano Grossi himself, has been involved in several safety and security inspections in Ukraine. There's also a permanent IAEA mission stationed at Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, as well as other nuclear facilities in Ukraine, and they're primarily there in a monitoring role. There's been a lot of technical support and assistance from the IAEA, which has included the delivery of critical equipment. At one stage, that also included potassium iodide tablets. There's also been several briefings to the Security Council by the IAEA calling for an end to shelling near the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. And then, very important, calls for the creation of a nuclear safety and security protection zone around Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, which has not yet really taken off. So the IAEA Director General has said about what has been happening at Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant that the situation is unprecedented. It's the first time that a military conflict has occurred amid the facilities of a large established nuclear power program, and a nuclear accident can have serious impacts within the country and beyond its borders, as we well know from other nuclear accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima in recent time. So then I'd like to turn attention to the African Nuclear Regulatory Framework, which is really instructive in this instance. And when I touch on the Treaty of Pelindaba, you will see why. So non-proliferation, safety and security are deeply embedded in the nuclear regulatory framework of the African continent. African states have been strong supporters of the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology for decades. And they recognize that there's a significant contribution that the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology can make to achieving the continent's development goals. And because of this interest and this recognition, the continent also supports several international regulatory frameworks that relate to nuclear safety and security, non-proliferation, and disarmament. So some of the major ones there is, of course, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation, the NPT, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, where we have only one African state, not a member state, the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the Nuclear Ban Treaty. We have 17 signatories, 16 ratifications, so a bit of work there still to be done. Then the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, one state signed but not ratified, one state not signed. There is support for the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, and of course, IAEA safeguards and other IAEA initiatives, especially as more African countries, and Savinka will touch on that in her presentation, have been showing interest in nuclear energy and including that in their power mix. But what is important is that Africa has a robust homegrown nuclear regulatory framework and institutions that complement and, as the Treaty of Pelindaba shows, often surpass international frameworks to which it belongs. So they're important to focus on is AFRA, the FNRBA, and then, of course, the Treaty of Pelindaba and its enforcement body, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, or AFCON. So just briefly, AFRA, the African Regional Cooperation Agreement for Research, Training, and Development related to nuclear science and technology. This entered into force in 1990, and its aim is to support socio-economic development on the continent through nuclear science and technology. Important there, AFRA is specifically mentioned in Article 8.3 of the Treaty of Pelindaba, which says, parties are encouraged to make use of the program of assistance available in IAEA and, in this connection, to strengthen cooperation under the African Regional Cooperation Agreement for Research, Training, and Development related to nuclear science and technology. Then the FNRBA, the Forum for Nuclear Regulatory Bodies in Africa. This was established in 2009, and it forms part of the IAEA's Global Nuclear Security and Safety Network. It was established with the purpose to enhance, strengthen, and harmonize the radiation protection, nuclear safety, and security regulatory infrastructure and framework among its members. And I think harmonization being the key word there. It's hosted several successful training workshops across the continent and is active across 6 thematic areas. These are legislative and regulatory infrastructure, radiation and waste safety, nuclear safety infrastructure, emergency preparedness and response, transport safety infrastructure, and nuclear security infrastructure. And then most importantly, there's a map that I created some years ago about the status of support for the Treaty of Pelindaba on the continent, the African Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, or Treaty of Pelindaba as it is also known. You will note there are 52 signatories and 42 ratifications. So large support for the treaty establishing the continent as a nuclear weapons-free zone, the largest in the world. Important there, and this is where the Treaty of Pelindaba becomes very instructive, because there isn't an international treaty that governs the protection of nuclear power plants in armed conflict. This one stands out as a continental treaty that does exactly that in 2 articles, Article 11 specifically, but Article 10 to be read in conjunction. So Article 10 relating to the physical protection of nuclear materials and facilities, which mandates each state party to the Treaty of Pelindaba to maintain the highest standards of security and effective physical protection of nuclear materials, facilities, and equipment. And then, most importantly, Article 11, the prohibition of armed attack on nuclear installations. This article says specifically that each party undertakes not to take or assist or encourage any action aimed at an armed attack by conventional or other means against nuclear installations in the African nuclear weapon-free zone. So this treaty is instructive to the situation at Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, but now we can see also to the situation in Iran, in Israel, where nuclear installations are increasingly coming under threat, since we do not have a multilateral treaty to govern the protection of nuclear installations against armed attack like the Pelindaba Treaty does. So, what more can be done to protect nuclear installations, to make such a treaty happen? I think most importantly, greater follow through and political will to do what is necessary. So, I'm just going to skip to this slide quickly. I'll go back to the other one. You will see that in an IAEA resolution from 1990, it was already recognized the urgency of concluding an international agreement in this regard being protecting nuclear installations against armed attack. So this was already recognized then, but no real efforts have been or have managed to bear any fruit. And so we still don't have that multilateral treaty. Important then, we need to also recognize the limitations of international law. As I said earlier, a lot of the times it comes down to interpretation, which makes things tricky, even though if we read it from the get-go, it looks like it should be pretty clear. Then we need to cement greater support for the IAEA and the strengthening of its mandate to be able to monitor nuclear safety and security. So right now, it can only do that if it is allowed to do so. When Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant was occupied, for example, the IAEA was not granted permission immediately to step in and observe. It had to be granted permission and waited a certain amount of time before it was allowed to go and observe and send its representatives. And then, of course, regulate compounding challenges, for example, safeguarding of staff at nuclear installations, corporate governance, and emerging threats like AI and rapidly developing drone technology. And Savinka will touch a little bit more on that in her presentation. And these are all elements that are also reflected in the paper that we launched today. I'm going to leave it there, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Isabel. That was incredibly sobering and very clear, and points out, what has been done, what hasn't been done, and really what needs to be done. I'm now going to turn over to Zvinka Kachur, who is a fellow at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at the University of Stellenbosch, and also honorary president of the Ukrainian Association of South Africa. Zvinka, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. And indeed, it's a pleasure to be here to launch this paper. And I also want to say that we're in the process of translation it into French and Arab languages. So I really hope that we'll be able to have this conversation in the wider with the wider community. I'll be focusing specifically on the case of Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant and how we got to the conclusions where we are. Can you see the presentation? Is it shared?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
So I think for the African continent, nuclear energy is seen as a critical technology. 22 African countries are interested and are working on their nuclear programs. Also, continent possess 14% of global uranium production, so this technology is seen as very viable. However, the recent development around nuclear safety and security poses a lot of questions whether nuclear technology can be operated safely. Currently, there is only one nuclear power plant, Koeberg, that is operational in South Africa, and another one is in the process of construction in Egypt. So in the case of Ukraine, there are two cases of the occupation of nuclear facilities. One is Chernobyl nuclear power plant that was occupied for 36 days. And following the 36 days, Russian army has withdrawn. So this nuclear power plant, which is decommissioned since 1986, has been deoccupied. Now, the case of the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant is much more complex. It was first occupied on the 4th of March 2022. It's one of the 10 largest nuclear power plants in the world, and it was fully operational at the time of the military attack. So Ukraine has a long experience of operating nuclear facilities. In 1994, it also gave up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. Currently, there are four operational nuclear power plants, and you can see on this slide that the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant is really on the front line. It stands on a it's bordering with the Dnipro River, so the Russian forces are occupying the left bank of the river, but not the right bank of the river. And the Zaporizhzhya city, which you can also see on this slide, is not occupied. So while the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant is occupied, the Zaporizhzhya city is not occupied. And in the green, you can see those territories that have been deoccupied after 2022. So initially in 2022, much larger territories were occupied by Russia. However, by the end of 2022, a significant part of those territories, including the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, were deoccupied. So the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant is based in Enerhodar city. This is the satellite city for the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. So all those who inhabit the city are involved in the managing of nuclear power plant. When the Russian military forces have come into the city, large numbers of civilians were coming to stop the tanks from entering the city and from attacking, understanding the risks of military coming into the nuclear facilities. So there was no military resistance to the occupation because civilians did not want to have the military attack on nuclear power plant. However, the Russian military forces still entered disregarding the civilian protest. Following that, Russia has declared the whole territory of Zaporizhzhya region. As you can see on the map, Zaporizhzhya region is not fully occupied by Russia, even as of today. However, Russia has declared the whole region as part of its constitutional territory. And following that decision on the 5th of October, a Russian presidential decree unilaterally appropriated the nuclear plant and declared it Russian state property. This is the first case of such military appropriation of the fully operational nuclear facilities of such scale. So since that time, since 4th of March 2022, this nuclear facilities remains on the front line because there has not been much more movement. So the Zaporizhzhya region remains not fully occupied, and this nuclear power plant remains under constant attack. On 11 July 2024, UN resolution has been voted, including 15 African states, supported it, which demanded that the Russian Federation immediately return full control of the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant to Ukrainian authorities. So here we come to the challenge that while there is a UN resolution demanding removal of Russian military forces, there is no implementation part to this resolution because UN Security Council remain inactive due to the veto right, because 5 members have the right to stop any UN resolution, and currently the majority has no option to overcome the veto, and this is also a necessary process to reform the UN Security Council so that majority of countries can overcome the veto of 5 countries. In March 2025, we can see that the ownership and control of the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant remains one of the key challenges for the peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, and it's constantly debated, including since President Trump has tried to be involved in a peace negotiation. He suggested that the US could take control and or ownership of the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. So we see that all those suggestions do not comply to any international regulations or any understanding of previously developed safety and security for a nuclear power plant. I would like to state that currently all nuclear units of the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant are in cold shutdown, which reduces the risk of a large-scale accident. However, it doesn't mean that the nuclear power plant is safe, as it constantly needs a number of support, and risks remain. So I wanted to highlight some of the challenges that are still not regulated in international law. So firstly, partially Isabel has mentioned that the IAEA mandate remains extremely limited. IAEA is expected to be the nuclear watchdog, the organization that promotes and ensures peaceful nuclear application. However, in practice, they completely dependent on a decision of state. So in the case of Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, they require Russian state permission to access any part of Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant. And while the mission was allowed to be monitoring since 1st September of 2022, they are not allowed to access different parts of the nuclear power plant. So for example, if there was a damage or there is a military equipment based on the nuclear power plant, most likely into that area, into that unit, IAEA mission will not be granted access. So IAEA mission could be limited to not leave the facilities at all, or on some days they can be allowed to move to different parts of the nuclear power plant. So by September 2022, it became obvious through IAEA report that all nuclear safety principles that were developed before, the 7 indispensable pillars, have been already compromised in the case of Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant. So by May 2023, IAEA has proposed 5 concrete principles to safeguard nuclear safety during armed conflict. However, we already see that even those new principles that were provided are already violated on a number of occasions. And in our first paper, we provide specific details on which pillars were violated when. So if anyone is interested, you can follow that. We can see that IAEA does play an important role, and in one case, at least, actually in few cases, it managed to negotiate temporal ceasefire to allow the mission to repair critical electrical lines, because nuclear power plant requires the electrical supply and water cooling systems access all the time. The new developments is that in December 2025 and in February 2026, Russian regulator provided licenses for operating of units 1 and 2 of Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, suggesting that Russian authorities are planning to restart Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, despite IAEA conclusions that the nuclear power plant is under command of the Ukrainian authorities. So we can see that IAEA cannot implement the nuclear safety and security principles despite multiple attempts and also innovations that especially Rafael Grossi is doing, and the mission that is monitoring also providing. So the next point that I wanted to raise is around the staff, nuclear power plant operators, and human rights and labor rights violations at Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. The occupation, and those who study conflicts understand that occupation means immediate violations of human rights and suffering. So there is a number of cases documented of physical and psychological abuses around the workers of Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. Now, those are the nuclear power plant operators, and very often after intimidations or after physical abuse, they were sent back to the shifts at the nuclear power plant. The Truth Hounds report can be found, and it provides a detailed interviews on the experiences of those who are operating nuclear power plant. And while majority of those violations have happened during the 2022-2023, when Russia was taking over the control of the nuclear power plant, we can see that they are ongoing even now. During 2025, International Labour Organization reports suggested that 13 employees had been abducted, including 3 in 2025. and the whereabouts of at least one worker remains unknown. So those violations also compromise the safety of operating nuclear power plant. And as of February 2024, instead of 11,500 of employees that was before the occupation, there were only 4,500 people employed. So here are some parts of the interview that suggest that when Russia realized that those who are operating nuclear power plant are not signing contracts with Rosatom, they started to use physical and psychological pressure, including pressure against the families. And another statement that suggests that Rosatom was present during those interrogation and intimidation, which raises the question of corporate responsibility of nuclear operating company when it comes to the human rights and labor rights violations. So I would like also to highlight the lack of legislation in safeguarding nuclear-related infrastructure, more specifically external supply grid, because the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant has 10 power lines that provide electricity, of risks to the cooling water sources and other critical infrastructure. So before the occupation, there were 10 lines that were supplying electricity to the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant. And unfortunately, there were now multiple occasions. As of January 26, there were at least 11 times loss of off-site power, so-called loop event, which is a major risk factor leading to severe nuclear accidents. While even more than 24 hours of loop is regarded as a significant risk to a nuclear power plant. In the case of the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, we had in 1 month from 23rd of September to 23rd of October 2025, when the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant was completely depending on diesel generator. It was also depending on the supply of diesel, of generators working. So we can see that this is significant risk for nuclear power plant. The question of water supply to the nuclear power plant also has been significantly damaged because the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant was built on a border of Kakhovka hydropower plant, which was destroyed on the 6th of June 2023. So this massive hydropower plant was destroyed, and why it's also environmental tragedy and the loss of drinking water for millions of people, as the dam provided a source of water for the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant cooling system, which is now inaccessible. So the other is the impact of the Russian attacks on Ukraine energy infrastructure, and Olena Lopenko will provide a little bit more details. I just wanted to stress the new risk of type of military attacks with drones. Yesterday, on 24th of March 2026, Ukraine was attacked with 948 drones. And this is a scale of attack which shows that none of the nuclear facilities can be safe. Since October 2022, Russia specifically targets Ukrainian energy infrastructure, while this is the war, international crime, because targeting civilian energy infrastructure is seen against the rules of war. However, this is a common practice, and that's how Ukraine has been multiple times without electricity. So drone warfare is something that we can see not only in Ukraine. Yes, maybe it's developed significantly in Ukraine, but now it's a question for multiple areas, including Iran, including the Middle East, on how can our nuclear power plants be protected. In case of the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, there are multiple cases when the drones have actually hit, and while the reactor is a relatively robust system, we cannot predict how much damage will be done. On February 25, a drone with warhead damaged the protective shelter over Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant Unit 4, causing fires that stayed for multiple days. So in conclusion, I think I wanted to highlight that the current experience of Ukraine's nuclear infrastructure suggests that this situation where nuclear power plants and the countries that gave up nuclear weapon cannot be safeguarded undermines the key principles of non-proliferation and also puts at risk that other countries will join non-proliferation treaty. It's also critical that there is legally binding with a clear enforcement mechanism, international rules to protect nuclear power plant facilities. We know about Pelindaba Treaty, however, there is a need for such legislation on international level, and maybe African states, together with many other countries who are interested in developing nuclear technology, can initiate such legally binding, and also the enforcement mechanism will be critical. There is also a need for binding legislation that protects critical infrastructure essential for nuclear safety, as we've seen in case of the Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, the damages to the Kakhovka dam, the damages to the energy supply lines are constant. And also addressing challenges of drone attacks. I think this is something that is relatively new. The drone technology develops extremely fast. We can see that every 6 months there is a technology breakthrough, and new types of drones, new types of AI is developed to manage those drone attacks. And there is a need for the legislation that looks into early warning systems for drones around the nuclear power plants, on the counter-drone technologies that can be used by nuclear operators or those who are safeguarding the perimeter of nuclear power plant, on trainings for nuclear operators, on response, and also on developing guidelines for emergency response. Currently, we're still missing all those points, and obviously different countries are trying to develop them individually, but maybe there is a need for a larger international discussion on that. And there is a need to expand IAEA mandate so that this organization can really be more effective. Thank you, and I'll pass the floor to Olena Lopenko from Dixie Group, our third co-author, who will look specifically on the attacks on the civilian infrastructure and the risks for operational nuclear power plant out of that.
Thank you, Zvinka. I hope you can hear me. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
And I'll share my presentation. And maybe I'll do it this way. Yeah. So you can see it like in full screen regime. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. The colleagues who spoke before me covered legal frameworks, governance challenges, and the occupation of the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. I want to offer a little bit different angle, a more technical one maybe, because I'm not nuclear specialist. I'm a power grid engineer, and I want to explain one more side or part of nuclear safety, what actually happens to nuclear power plant when the grid around is under attack. The title of my presentation is Power Grid Disruptions as a Vector of Nuclear Risk. A vector meaning a pathway, a mechanism through which risk travels. Maybe not the most obvious one, but as Ukraine's experience shows, a very real one. Let me start with some contexts. Ukraine has not one, as already Zinka mentioned in her presentation, but 4 nuclear power plants. Besides the occupied Zaporizhzhya NPP, 3 plants continue to operate. Rivne nuclear power plant in the northwest, South Ukraine NPP in the south, and the Khmelnytskyi NPP in the west part of Ukraine. Together, they run 9 reactor units of the VVER type. It's Soviet-designed pressurized water reactors. Before the full-scale war, nuclear energy provided between 45 and 55% of Ukrainians' electricity. So that was already a big share by any standard, I think. But when Russia began systematically destroying thermal and hydro generation capacity in Ukraine, the share of nuclear in the generation mix jumped to approximately 67% or even 70%, based on Dixie Group's data from October 2025. It just estimates, I want to highlight, because a lot of data about energy sector is closed due to the wartime regime. So look at these two charts on the slide. The left one shows the generation mix in 2021, and the right one shows where we are now. Nuclear is a blue segment here, and has grown from just over half to nearly 2/3 of everything Ukraine generates on a given day. This means something very specific. The stability of Ukrainians' entire power system now rests on the stable operation of these 3 nuclear power plants. And stable operation means not only keeping the reactors running, but also it means having a functioning grid to deliver that power to consumers. And because if you generate electricity and there is nowhere to send it, you don't simply stop the turbine, you start cycling the reactor, and that is also a problem. So let's look at how the attacks evolved in Ukraine, because this is not static picture as you see on the slide. The chart shows waves of massive strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure since February 2022. What you see here is not just escalation in numbers through the scale in late 2025 and early 2026 is striking. What you see is methodical expansion of targets also. For example, in 2022 and 2023, the primary targets were key transmission substations through all the Ukraine's territory. The goal mostly was to create blackout, and it worked. We had a near total blackout in November 2022. Then later in 2024, the focus shifted to thermal and hydro generation itself, destroying the physical capacity to produce electricity. And in 2025, gas production infrastructure came under attack, cutting fuel supply to what remained of thermal generation. And then, and this is the part most relevant to nuclear safety, systematic strikes began appearing on substations directly connected to nuclear power plants, the substations that connect NPP output lines to the wider grid. And by late 2025 and into 2026, we see combined drone and missile strikes hitting every component simultaneously: generation, transmission, heating systems, and in major cities in Ukraine. So all pillars at once. It was to mention here the direct systematic attacks on nuclear power plants themselves remain limited. There have been isolated incidents documented by the IAEA, but you don't need to hit a reactor to create a nuclear safety problem. You hit the substation 10 kilometers away, and the effect reaches the reactor within seconds. This brings us to the core technical argument. VVR reactors, the type operating at all of Ukraine's plants, were designed for baseload operation. That means they are optimized to run at stable, high capacity continuously. They are not flexible machines, so they were never intended for frequent power adjustments. But when the grid is damaged and cannot absorb full output of that generators, the operator must reduce reactor power. And when grid conditions change again, power must be raised. So this cycling under normal circumstances, rare and planned, has become routine in Ukraine. What does this mean technically? Repeated power reductions and restarts create thermal stress on fuel assemblers and the reactor pressure vessel. They accelerate wear on turbine and generator equipment. They increase the risk of equipment failure during power transients. And over time, they reduce the safety margins that reactor design built in. None of this is a dramatic single event. It is cumulative and mostly quiet and invisible in the news. But the IAEA has been tracking it, and the chart here on the slide shows the number of documented mentions of NPP capacity reductions due to grid constraints. We gathered this data from IAEA reports from 2022 to early 2026. The peak in 2025, it's 12 separate mentions, is not a coincidental. The IAEA has recently expanded its monitoring mission beyond the nuclear plant perimeters to electrical substations. As of February 2026, IAEA teams have visited 12 substations across Ukraine. I want to emphasize again, the IAEA is now monitoring also substations, not just reactors. This is a precedent also. It is a practical acknowledgement that the nuclear safety perimeter does not end at the reactor fence. Just last month, in February 2026, one of Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant's two remaining off-site power lines was disconnected due to military activity near nearby substations. At the same time, attacks on the wider grid forced almost all operating reactor units across Ukraine to reduce power. One unit was disconnected from the grid entirely, and IAEA teams at Khmelnytsky and Rivne NPPs had to shelter in place. So this is the reality, and this is what's happening in Ukraine. And it is becoming, as Director General Grossi said, all too common. So what does all of this tell us beyond Ukraine, beyond the specific case of Zaporizhzhya? I tried to offer 5 insights that I think are important for any country considering nuclear energy, and that includes many countries represented in this conversation today. First is that nuclear safety is also a grid problem, not just a reactor problem. Grid stability is a precondition for safe nuclear power plant operation. It is not a separate engineering issue. It belongs inside the nuclear safety conversation. The second insight is that nuclear safety perimeter does not end at the nuclear power plant fence. Substations, transmission lines, water supply systems, cooling infrastructure, these all are parts of the nuclear safety system. If they are not protected, the reactor is also not protected. The third one, frequency matters as much as severity. We tend to think about nuclear risk in terms of dramatic single events, for example, as Chernobyl or Fukushima, but Ukraine is showing a different pattern. Accumulated risk from repeated stress. No single catastrophe, just a reactor being pushed outside the conditions it was designed for again and again. The first one, IAEA's expansion to substation monitoring is a precedent that should become a policy. The practice is ahead of the law. International legal frameworks still define nuclear installations narrowly. They have not caught up with what operational reality is showing us. And the last point, and perhaps the most important, what is not protected in law will be targeted in war. Ukraine's experience demonstrates this directly. The ambiguity in international frameworks around supporting infrastructure, substations, cooling water, power lines became an operational vulnerability, and it was exploited. So thank you, and maybe I will close my presentation with one thought. Much of today's discussion rightly focuses on the occupation of Zaporizhzhya Nuclear Power Plant, the most dramatic, surely, and visible nuclear safety crisis in decades. But I hope my presentation has shown that the threat to nuclear safety in Ukraine extends far beyond the occupied plant. Three operating nuclear plants carrying 2/3 of the country's electricity are managing reactor operations under conditions of chronic grid instability. That is not a normal operational environment, and it is a situation that existing international frameworks were not designed to address. The IAEA is adapting in practice, in fact, and the question is whether law and policy will follow. For countries in Africa and elsewhere that are considering or developing nuclear programs, the lesson from Ukraine is not that nuclear energy is too dangerous. The lesson is that nuclear safety planning must include also the grid, the substations, the water supply, the transmission lines, all of it. And because if you generate safely but cannot deliver safely, you have only solved half of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olenka, for the detailed and indeed in-depth presentation. I think it was very useful for all involved in the nuclear programs. And I have a privilege now to ask for comments on the presentations from Ambassador Pedro Villagra Delgado, who is a member of the Argentine Council on International Relations Consultative Board and director of the Consultative Board's Committee on Nuclear Affairs. Ambassador also formerly was ambassador of Argentina to Germany, also the Sherpa for G20 for Argentina, and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it is really a big honor to have you and also to hear your insights. Argentina is also safely operating nuclear facilities, so it would be very nice to hear your feedback.
Good afternoon for you. Good evening, practically. I'm just hitting noon. Well, in my first reaction is that how lucky we are in Latin America not to have these problems. And the problems that are associated basically with war and conflict. I'm a lawyer by training. I used to teach international law in the University of Buenos Aires, and I have also a master's degree in London. And one of the things that strikes me is because we are trying to see how the big powers or whoever gets into nuclear, into an armed conflict can attack or not attack. Actually, I'm convinced that all facilities, nuclear power facilities, no nuclear weapons, no things that are related to military use eventually, should be out completely of any attack. And one of the things that we tend to forget in all these attacks that we are living today, the ones in the Middle East, the ones in Ukraine, of course, regarding in the specific line of attacking nuclear power reactors. I mean, Bushehr has been also hit. It seems that it's a minor thing, thanks God, but it has been hit recently. We tend to, when we say that we have to improve the rules in international law, one of the realities that we have there in that field is that some or most of the big countries, the ones that have the possibility, the ones that have nuclear weapons, by the way, normally are not party to these treaties, and when they are, they don't comply with them. Not just this thing, because the main rule that should be protecting the nuclear power reactors is Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, which is the non-use of force. And that's the first thing that And we have already this sort of a Pavlovian reflex of not even mentioning that, because we just take it, we have to go to find specific norms that will say that nuclear power reactors and their components, because, well, what Lorena said is true. It's not a nuclear reactor is not only the reactor, it's the whole system. And that's why we have all these international safeguards in the IAEA and beyond. We have some in the case of Argentina and Brazil with ABAC, but it's because it is a much more complex thing. We don't have an IAEA for hydroelectric power. We don't have a IAEA but to gas power. We don't have to use of oil. Why? Because it's not as dangerous as nuclear power when it is attacked in this way in an armed conflict. So probably the first thing we have to start asking or demanding the countries that are participating in these attacks is to comply with Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. That's the first one. Because otherwise, we will have the rules. If we could manage to have it, obviously that will be a certain comfort, but basically we're a comfort by which will allow us to blame them a bit more, because the reality is that we are seeing on a daily basis that international law is not compliant. It has not always been like that. Obviously, there have been sort of failures in to respect the international law in its fullness, but now in the last decade or so, we have been a persistent violation of those rules by countries that actually possess the most important military. And one of the things that it's also a source of concern is that when powers they possess nuclear energy and the right, quote unquote, through the NPT and others of having nuclear weapons, if they will start sort of using, because one of the things that we have lived in the last 3-4 years has been the banalization of the threats or the comments on that nuclear weapons can be used. For instance, in the scenario of the Ukrainian war in particular, in the invasion of Russia, that has been said many times that they do not discard the use of tactical weapons, and others will respond as the same, and then we will start in a very, very dangerous game, frankly. And this is something we all have to try to work to make sure that this doesn't happen. Because if the case will be that some countries that have nuclear weapons can actually use them, even if they don't, but just the threat that they might use them, that certainly will be an incentive, a very powerful incentive for countries that are in the brink of getting or not nuclear weapons to actually try to go for them. Because that may, the whole scenario in the world may change. In that sense, I'm very glad that, as I mentioned, that I have the feeling how lucky we are in Latin America by not having these kind of problems, but this is not something that came just out of the blue. I've had the privilege of participating in the opening of the Brazilian and Argentine nuclear programs since the beginning, the end of the 80s, and then during the 90s to develop the bilateral mechanism through ABAC, and then joining together the NPT, which was something that before we didn't do. Brazil or Argentina saying that it was a discriminatory treaty, which, by the way, it is. That's reality. But, well, in this case, see, if we all join to sort of remedy the inequality, we're going to end up in a world which is much worse. That's the reality. And that's why we managed to do that, the quadripartite agreement with the IAEA on safeguarding together the programs of Argentina, Brazil. And that was part also of a process that in Argentina and Brazil and in Latin America in general came with democracy in the beginning of the 80s, and saying, well, to eliminate, which were called during the 70s and the 60s, during the time of the Cold War, there was this question of the conflict hypothesis with your neighbors. Well, In Latin America, we had some differences, but basically we are quite similar, all of us, and certainly we tend naturally more to friendship than to war. And our history proves that in 200 plus years of independence, some of us have had one or two wars in the hand, not against each other, by the way. So that's an important thing. But this getting together that made an essential approach that nuclear energy should be used for what peaceful purposes. The Tlatelolco Treaty, that was the, the big contribution of the Mexicans to this whole process in the 60s, was very important to that, because even the ones that were not parties, as we were not, Brazil was not as well, in Chile until the 90s, but it was not because we were just trying to build a bomb to throw to each other. So that made already quite a big difference. So the other cases we're seeing, for instance, in the Middle East. But one of the things that we have to keep insisting, I think, is if the weakening of the system of safeguards, the IAEA, and the lack of respect for international law coming for those who, by the way, because they are the biggest, they have permanent seats in the Security Council. So when this kind of threats, like the one that experienced Ukraine through Russia or other worse somewhere else, that when the countries that have the most responsibility to keep the peace and international security having become the violators, then the world is in real trouble, because other countries may be tempted to go to this kind of magic solutions of having nuclear weapons, thinking with that you are solving your problems. And in fact, you can not only not solve them, but make them much worse. Ukraine and South Africa are the only two countries that actually disarm nuclear. And so, by the way, both in the 90s, it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you could teach us a bit of how to do this for the countries that are thinking of having nuclear weapons, but at the same time, when you read the press today, some people are saying, well, they made a mistake in disarming, because at the end of the day, what has the world been in the case of Ukraine, for instance, if Ukraine would have kept their own weapons? Well, we don't know that, but maybe things you'll be in peace, but on the other hand, the war may be a much bigger one. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind in this case too is that it's not only having nuclear weapons is a very expensive exercise. And when it comes to effective delivery systems, the security of the installations and all that is very complicated. And on top of that, it may just to keeping the nuclear weapons safe and is secure, both safe and secure, is something that can cost trillions of dollars. So it is, once you embark on that path, maybe many of the programs for development are going to be left aside. So in order not to have too many countries possessing nuclear weapons, I think the best recipe will be for the ones that are sitting in the Security Council and developing countries to actually help in getting peace and also development. I think the two have to go together. One of the most important things that we have to keep in mind are also in this enormous danger of getting countries being tempted to possess nuclear weapons. Now we have seen, I will not name them because otherwise I'll get into trouble even if I'm already retired, but some very developed countries, rich countries that have been covered by the umbrella of the United States for a long time, the nuclear umbrella, are already losing the possibility of getting nuclear weapons to be safer, but for the world to contribute, that instead of having the umbrella of someone, to have your own umbrellas and make the parapluie de Cherbourg in a different kind of environment. And that could really trigger an arms race that we don't know how to be controlled, because one of the things that we know that nowadays is that with all these advances in technology, such as AI, quantum computing, additive manufacturing, those things make easier to get nuclear weapons. And that is not a good news. I mean, technology, and also imagine what can be the future if we have nuclear weapons that follow the path of other weapons and they become autonomous. We have this terrible discussion now because Anthropics in the United States and the Department of Defense, because of the reaction in the government to restrict the principles of the technology, apply it to technology of the company in order that not go to do things would be against the ethics of the ones selling the technology. So that's really another thing that we have to keep in mind, frankly, is it's things that give us food for thought. I think that in Latin America, in the mostly Argentina and Brazil were the two countries that have actually meaningful nuclear technology. We're not in the forefront, but in some aspects, we have, for instance, in Africa, Algeria and Egypt have nuclear research reactors that were designed and provided by Argentina. So the effect of the nuclear weapons might be also detrimental to the revival of the nuclear energy as one of the best options that produce baseload energy without producing emissions of CO2. So I think that this is something that we all have to balance, because if some countries emphasize the negative part of nuclear weapon, of nuclear energy by going through or developing more nuclear weapons instead of that will affect negatively the legitimate uses of nuclear energy, which are immense, and it's a very good thing for the rest of the world. But that's that. The essential thing that we have to keep in mind, I come back to my first comments, is it's not a question just to make laws more precise in international law. If the most part of countries are not prepared to comply the one that exists, they will never comply the ones that are more detailed. They will step aside. For instance, in the case of I was at odds with my own government when the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons came up. I was against, because I think this prohibition, the need to eliminate nuclear weapons, is already in Article 6 of the NPT. That was the original part of the bargain when the promoters of the NPT speak about the bargain. The bargain was to get the technologies to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and also to have they share the technologies with the safeguards. But the other part of the bargain was that eventually there would have to be a nuclear disarmament. And unfortunately, that Article 6 has become a consideration that is just a sort of an aspirational norm. The Article 6, if you read the NPT, is nothing aspirational. It's very clear. The only thing is it has been being complied with. That's different. So the countries that should have done this disarmament are in fact in breach of Article 6 of NPT. The only thing is that nobody is saying that that's the case nowadays. We have accepted to the point that we need another treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Of course, in that treaty, none of the members that are nuclear weapon states will ever ratify nor even sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope that we could do something that is better than just proclaiming great principles, and when we see that they are violated, the actual hard rules are violated every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for putting this issue into perspective, and also drawing such a good picture of really ecosystem where nuclear weapon is connected to nuclear power plants and also connected to global order and how the so-called big states are complying or choosing not to comply to international regulation. At least, indeed, it's a much bigger question. I think here both African continent and Latin American countries through Pelindaba and Tlatelolco treaties showed their commitment to non-proliferation and maybe can work together towards continuing that movement to safe operating of nuclear power plants. While Ambassador is very happy to be in Argentina, where drones are not flying, we are now turning to our colleagues in Qatar, who might not be as happy. And I'm very delighted to welcome two colleagues, Rashid Mohanadi, who is a researcher at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, and the engineer Badr Nasser Al-Saadi, who is a nuclear expert, to share their perspective, especially as now you also in this situation where you can feel those risks.
So, good evening from our side. Good morning to and good afternoon to people on the other side of the world. I'm happy to report that we've had a quiet 5 days. You know, the last Iranian attack was on Ras Laffan, which unfortunately took out a few of our producing units, but it's been a quiet few days. But the last 3 weeks were a series of worst case scenarios. We had attacks on our military facilities, attacks on our civilian facilities, attacks on our oil and gas and energy facilities. We have the Strait of Hormuz closed. On the other side of the Gulf, we've had attacks on nuclear facilities, multiple nuclear facilities. So it is just a series of worst case scenarios. So it makes me wonder, as somebody who used to do some risk assessments for the energy sector, were these really worst case scenarios, or were, now we need to think a little bit outside of the box, unfortunately. When the colleagues, Kachur and other colleagues, asked me to speak, I said I have to bring Engineer Bedr. He is our national expert in nuclear security. But I wanted to start the discussion and just create a scene setting. As you know, the Middle East has always been a hotbed for instability. But unfortunately, this conflict, one of the underlining natures of this specific conflict is the non-respect of international law on both sides and the crossing of red lines on both sides. The Israelis bombed the fuel depots in Tehran and attacked the nuclear facilities in Natanz. Most recently, they attacked Bushehr, which is a couple of 100 kilometers away from Qatar. The Iranians attacked cities, they've attacked energy facilities, they've attacked a desalination plant in Qatar. Hopefully, the plant is still operational, but this was at the beginning of the war, 3-4 days into the war. And a country like Qatar is heavily reliant on desalination for water. So it's been a series of worst case scenarios. And I was very happy to hear the assessments of all the other experts. I'd like to bring in Engineer Bedr to discuss, his point of view as a nuclear expert, and then if there are any security or defense questions, I can pitch in. So please, Bedr.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be part of this, this seminar. It's very amazing, and actually, I liked what I did hear from everybody. And I think we'll agree on one point of everything: that safety is the paramount of everything. So, I mean, I did draw the nuclear power plant. It's like in the back of behind me. But to understand the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, and actually I did understand a few things. First of all, let me tell you something. I'm a nuclear engineer, and basically I studied in South Korea, and I have a master's degree in nuclear safety and security and safeguards in UK. So I do understand the international legal, ratification of this, and also I understand that some part of engineering. So I'm a mix of both. So I will focus my discussion in three parts. One discussion is that the article itself that had been sent by my colleague, Mr. Rashid, I found it's very informative and actually very important to understand a few things. First of all, the MBT is the most powerful instrument, legal instrument in the world, because of it. Actually, it happened after in the World War II, and actually it's paramount to understand that treaty is still effective till this day by a lot of countries, and a lot of member states has been signed to it. But like also in the article, especially in page 29, the defense of the NPT secretaries, especially in the part 4, which is recognized that attacks on Ukraine nuclear infrastructure, including systematic targeting of substations, serving of. So this is actually will give us some insight. Like Ukraine actually disarmed the third largest arsenal of nuclears, and instead of getting protected, they are getting attacked. So that point of understanding how NPT actually will affect as a legal instrument throughout the member states is very important. Also, we think we need to understand how we need to create like a model or approach how to improve enforce our legal international mechanism. I think the IA safeguards, or actually they are doing very good job in doing this, but I think there's something should be more superior to what's happening right now here. And even according to the ambassador, he just mentioned a very good point. Like there should be, maybe could be a hidden agenda of race that could, like, for weapons, nuclear weapons. So that's something we should understand. So I think that all the major treaties actually supporting the fact, like MBT, CPNNM amendments, and also UN Security Resolution 154 and 0, and UN Nuclear Security Council Resolution, which is 1373. Actually, they are very important to understand, also to protect the countries and member states from nuclear terrorism. However, so with the situation that's happening now, as you know, as Mr. Rashid has explained, in the region, that we have a lot of, let's say, we've been through a lot of things through this war, and actually we understand the situation is very important, that we should have, a proper mechanism on this. So I'm going to take to the part 2, which is to show you, to explain to you the view, or the the view of the state of Qatar regarding the nuclear safety during the armed conflict. So I propose some few ideas, and I can share that paper to Mr. Rashid, so also he can share it with the whole group. Basically, it's just 4 important things that I think we should focus on during the article that I've read. We should have establishment of binding international convention, which should be superior than NPT. And I think that will be very hard, as according to the ambassador. It's Pedro. It's not very easy to happen, because of the member states who have nuclear weapons. And maybe we'll have some difficulty adding to the fact that we should establish one, which is very stronger than the NPT as before. And the classification of nuclear facilities as special protected facility, as all of you have mentioned in your presentations recently, the importance of substations, the electrical power supply, and the communication control, and transport and access routes. All this is very important. So I think we need to have like a special kind of a treatment to it, and also I think should be special. It should be under a special umbrella. Also, being effective under the IA. Substation is very important. It's good to know that through a presentation of Olina, that we found that IA actually is as monitoring substations, which is very important and very good to know. Actually, I didn't know about that until now. And also regarding any attacks that affect the infrastructure, should be detailed too. And the last but not least, which is mandatory safety and no-fly zones, establish demilitarized zones and airspace restrictions around nuclear stations. I think this is the most important thing that we should act onto this. This is like my view as a nuclear safety and security expert on this. And this will help us to understand that if we actually achieve, like, nuclear power plant is not just one unit that actually generate electricity. It's the whole system, the whole system, the grid, the cooling, the dam, the reservoirs, all of them have been included in one system, and we have to make sure they're protected. And the same thing also for us as a Qatar, since we are not a nuclear country, but we are surrounded by nuclear countries. That's also very important, that we should have also our own emergency plans, so to keep up with the safety and security issues. And I think that's pretty much. Other than that, we should refine our framework for international level. I think should be it should be like an international thing. Like every member state in this world should act on this according to what's happened with the Ukraine and Russia situation, and the current situation in the Middle East. And also with the emerging of new technologies using AI and using quantum mechanics and everything else. This is very important, and also in the future, we maybe after 20 years, we're also going to have nuclear fusion, which is something that I really saw that, and actually I can foresee in the future from China. So there's a lot of things happening right now. So we have to make sure that we have all the details information in that part. So the last thing I wanted to discuss, which is the last part, as a nuclear power plant, which I studied, the VVR, the technology itself is very safe. It's not an issue. It's a very safe technology. The issue with everybody who doesn't understand nuclear, they will think nuclear is just one thing, one bad thing, or one bad apple that could affect everything. So nuclear technology is a very safe technology, and also with the VVR, they have like 4 levels and defense in depth, mechanism. They have active safety as an active safety, and there's a passive safety for it. So, and also they already plan for every kind of accident that could happen in the reactor, but still with all the situation, and I'm surprised it's still integrated and still a little bit integral safety to compare to what should be done. So I think reactors and technology itself is very safe. I think we need to focus in parts of legal international mechanism, and also we should have like a different kind of like a group that actually focus and like enforcing that technology and enforcing the legal violation on the countries that actually do attack nuclear facilities. I think that's pretty much what I can say. I'm happy if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much. I mean, this has been so eye-opening from different parts of the world, Latin America, the Middle East, South Africa, and of course, Ukraine. The last speaker we're going to have is Sam Ramani, a colleague and friend of mine, joining us from the UK. He is a special fellow at RUSI, and I know has done a lot of work on Rosatom and what it's been up to in the last while. So Sam, you'll be the last presenter, and then we'll hopefully have about 20 minutes for Q&A with the group. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, and I'm actually working on a paper. I'm finishing it up on Rosatom's involvement in Africa. So this is a good time to be discussing that. So yeah, Rosatom has basically emerged as a very vital tool of Russian power projection in Africa. Its origins as a power projection tool date back actually quite early on, when Dmitry Medvedev reestablished Russia's interest in Africa through his 4-country tour back in 2009. We saw Sergei Kiriyenko, his right-hand man, in many of the key deals that were being brokered in that trip. And then Kiriyenko obviously is a key figure behind Rosatom, and that was when the Russian nuclear energy leadership basically became enmeshed with the presidential strategy inside Africa. And then flash forward to the establishment of the regional marketing office in sub-Saharan Africa in Cape Town around 2010 and 2012, the exploration of the first projects shortly after that in places like Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Rwanda. Many of those projects didn't actually transpire, but it was a clear show of ambition on the continent. And then really since 2022, we've seen a ratcheting up and ramping up of Rosatom's role. Rosatom, unlike most of the other major Russian state companies, has been exempt from the sanctions regime. So not sanctioned by the United States, not sanctioned by the EU, not sanctioned by anyone. So Rosatom has played multiple purposes for the Russian state. It's been a key cash revenue generator when it comes to the marketing of multi-billion-dollar nuclear energy projects. It's been part of Russia's soft power projection because it shows Russia as a country that's willing to invest in local technology, local engineers, train talent at home, as well as also in renewable energy, particularly solar energy, which changes this image of just being a gas station for Europe or a fossil fuel dependent power. Also, we're seeing Rosatom play an increasingly important role in terms of defense financing for the Ukraine war, in part because transactions can be moved through it, especially as Gazprom Bank, the old other outlet, has faced sanctions from the United States and Gazprom is being phased out incrementally in Europe, and it seems to be the only safe harbor for a lot of those sorts of transactions to take place. And it's unsurprising that key figures associated with Rosatom also become important within the Russian state and its apparatus and its orbit. Kirienko now is in charge of the occupied territories. There's some people thinking he might even be one of the people who's in line to be a successor to Putin. So it's very clear that Rosatom has become an incredibly important tool of Russia's power projection in Africa. And given the layers of political connectivities that I've just mentioned and the diversity of its offerings to Russian diplomacy and the Russian state, it seems to go well beyond just being a provider of nuclear energy. It is something that is much more of a soft power tool and a tool of power projection writ large. So that's kind of why that's my overall framing that I wanted to kind of discuss it with. With regards to the flagship project of Rosatom, just to kind of describe how it's progressing, the benchmark still seems to be the Al Dabaa reactor inside Egypt. So Egypt right now is obviously having a myriad of macroeconomic problems and crises. We even saw President Sisi basically admit that publicly in the days following the war with Iran. And one of them basically relates to the issue of its energy landscape. Overpopulation, demographic and continued demographic dividend that hasn't quite really reaped fruit inside Egypt. Uncertainties about long-term investments in very potentially profitable, but also uncertain technologies like green hydrogen. We've also seen situations where Egypt's Zohr field, the flagship gas field that's tied to ENI, has had some turbine and mechanical problems that have slowed the progress of its development. And given that uncertain and quite fractious energy landscape, debt arrears to foreign companies popping up, and now, there's been a dependency and a tendency to lean on Gulf investment, especially from the United Arab Emirates. Now a bit more uncertain with the sovereign wealth funds, at least in the near term, making some tough choices with regards to the war. Where are we headed with regards to the energy landscape? And Rosatom has played an important role through Al Dabaa in kind of providing a longer term support for the vehicle for that. It's basically got a 60-year design life for the project. It is costing about $30 billion. It's largely funded on low interest loans that can be prepaid over a 22-year period. Egypt is covering 15% off the bat, and the rest of it's being repaid. So for a country that's got energy and security features and also questions with regards to the lines of credit and also financial pressures, it does seem to be a project that is having some appeal for the Egyptians. Already, we're seeing about one-third of it being complete. We have about 30,000 workers who are on site. Many of those workers are actually Egyptian workers, and the Egyptian workers themselves are building the reactors, they're building the bubblers, they're building the foundation slabs, shell tiers, everything that you need to basically build it. And that localization agreement is something that is quite significant. And yes, at a time when Egypt is facing so many pressures in its energy landscape, not to mention the geopolitical ones, which I didn't even bring up, the conflicting EEZs in the Eastern Mediterranean or the GERD dispute that's going on with Ethiopia, it kind of becomes an important vehicle of the low carbon energy risks. On the flip side, we've seen the other challenge that comes from Rosatom in the experience of South Africa during the Jacob Zuma era, where it was basically associated with the worst excesses in many people's eyes, with state capture, corruption, overpricing, and overcharging. And though there does seem to be a bit of a renewed foray from South Africa into working with Rosatom, and this MOU in 2026, and at least from the Russian side, at least the Russians are spinning it from my sources in Moscow, as well as what I've been seeing in the media, they are talking about things like skill development and local production and developing SMR capacity. So they're trying to basically rebrand themselves now, not just as kind of an extractive cash cow for the Russian regime, but something that actually it contributes to longer term development, taking the El Daba model and kind of trying to transfer that to South Africa to make people forget some of the travails of the Zuma era and the travails of the past. Russia is also emerging with Rosatom as as a key provider of solar energy, and its main target countries in that respect do seem to be the AES juntas in the Sahel, so Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So Nova Wind is a subsidiary that's really dominated in the Sahel sector, and they're actually making agreements with all three of those countries in various forms. Uh, they are basically trying to frame themselves as being able to kind of basically take advantage of energy deficiencies in these areas and kind of add rapid capacity expansion. So they're not just offering, solar energy as an alternative to leverage the topography of the landscape. They're also offering an enticing scalability model. That seems to be what they're trying to bring forward. And in addition, they're actually making forays and making attempts to integrate and invest in local electrical grids and also devise planning systems for the energy ministries or the energy officials of the respective country. That's something that we're particularly seeing the model in Burkina Faso. So it's grid construction, it's energy planning, basically 20 years of energy security kind of being provided by this, as well as Nova Wind solar energy and development. There's a 5 gigawatt target that they've set for planting these around in Africa, and the Sahel is kind of quite important with regards to that. The biggest one, if you're interested in this more, is the Seinen Koroba in Mali. That's the one that seems to have gotten developed more. But there are making developments in forays with a more formalized structure in Niger, I think a more informalized structure with regards to what we're seeing inside Burkina Faso. And there's radioisotope MOUs and other things. So the buzzword that they're using, of course, in addition to localization, is also electrification. It's kind of like, taking the Repower EU concept and really kind of calibrating it more towards the global south. So what are the so definitely we're seeing it now, Rosatom becoming a political tool for Russia's military deployments under Africa Corps in the Sahel. So now they're offering not just security from counterterrorism, which is very iffy, given the uneven success of many of their operations, but now they're claiming to offer energy security as well. So, what are some of the critiques of Rosatom, and that still remain valid, given the fact that they are presenting this kind of renewable face as well as kind of an Aldaba model? And what are the kind of things that we should be watching out for in the next future? So, I'm going to go through this very briefly because I know that we want to answer some questions. And I would love to take questions on this myself if there's anyone there. The big problems that we're seeing enduringly are obviously the original one. I mean, the debt trap issue, right? Basically, you don't just have poor countries having loans of credit, even if the loans are on favorable terms and with 3% interest rates like we're seeing in Egypt. You're seeing a kind of financial dependency being created, as well as kind of a fuel supply dependency, maintenance dependency, expertise dependency. They seem to be training engineers, which is good. And they, for example, the tripling of spots from Ethiopians in engineering facilities has been modeled in other African countries. That was something that was announced at the July 2023 St. Petersburg Summit. But they're not really training those engineers to actually produce some of the cutting edge components that Russia has. It's more about maintenance, supply, and development. So that's kind of a kind of a knowledge and human capital gap that's also there. There are also questions about, poor oversight of the workforce. So some of the same abusive practices that we're seeing in Ukraine could potentially translate into Rosatom's activities in Africa. We've already seen histories of institutionalized racism and poor relationships between senior command and junior command in military operations like Mozambique. That kind of toxic culture could also be spreading towards nuclear energy space here. I was hearing about that in some of my research on facilities where forays are being developed. And also there are some questions about whether this is being used more as an expensive tool of sanctions evasion, especially given Russia's sourcing of metallurgical components and even some military parts from African countries to fill supply chain gaps in the Ukraine war. Gabon's junta, for example, not a Rosatom destination, but has been doing that and acting as a transit route. So maybe other countries are also involved there too. Moreover, there's a feeling that when I was talking to officials in Nigeria, in many West African countries, as well as also in Egypt and South Africa. My overall feeling was that there were questions as to how committed Rosatom really is to nuclear safety, and that takes us back to the theme of this overall session. There seems to be questions about poor regulatory frameworks. There's a lot of concerns that the models could actually lead to accidents, and Russian disaster crews may not actually necessarily be there. Sometimes SMRs and floating power units are being used as quick fix solutions. They're being dangled in places where the infrastructure just isn't prone for it, or in the case of the Sahel, where where the security landscape is extremely weak. These could become destinations for terrorism and sabotage. That's something that the Nigerians are thinking about when they're looking northward at what's happening over here. They could even be targets of civil society groups, seeing them as like kind of economic bottlenecks and maybe launching environmentally motivated, more extremist attacks. That's obviously secondary to the Islamic terrorism risk, but that's also something that's there. And then there's also the risk that sanctions could tighten and secondary sanctions could get enforced more unpredictably and vigorously, especially with the Trump administration not having a clear rudder and not having a clear roadmap for sanctions enforcement. It seems to be reactive to how Putin treats them, as we saw with the energy companies. And that could lead to supply chain bottlenecks mid-flow in projects. So countries could spend billions of dollars on a project and find themselves without supplies.
Sam, I don't want to
And
interrupt you, just to ask you to wrap, please,
yeah.
because we do want to have some questions.
Yeah, I'm wrapping
Sorry.
up within a minute or two. Yeah, and that kind of plays into the broader neo-colonial critique. So as you can see, they managed to change their modeling and their branding, but a lot of the old issues are still intact. So just 1 minute or so. What next for Rosatom in Africa? Like, where should we be looking for them? I still think that we will be seeing a large focus on Egypt's whatever they're doing in South Africa and the Sahel. The other countries to watch out for in terms of growth and development would be Ethiopia. They signed a major agreement at the World Atomic Week in September 2025, and that could actually lead to a large SMR project. They're doing feasibility studies right now. They've actually had some ongoing science and technology discussions between delegations at the end of last year. And I think that we should be looking for what they're doing in Eastern Africa and the Great Lakes region. So if the Sudanese civil war comes to an end, they might do something there. But more, I think, tangibly in the near term, it's probably the research centers that they have in Rwanda. And even though there's a lot of cost disputes and uncertainty about the Museveni transition, possibly something that's happening in Uganda. So those would be kind of the countries to watch in terms of moving forward. I watch at forums to see what will be announced. I believe there's a major forum coming up next month in Nigeria with nuclear energy, and more deals may be announced there. So these World Atomic Weeks and these African forums are very good benchmarks for looking forward and seeing what they're going to be doing.
Sam, thank you so much. I'll just give you a plug. Sam's written some excellent books, one on Russia and Africa, another on the Ukraine war. And this paper, what he's talking about, hopefully will be coming up in a paper that SAIA is publishing as soon as we get the text from Sam. So thank you, everybody. Really, really interesting. I mean, been a fantastically rich discussion on so many aspects, and then we've almost come back full circle, starting in Africa and coming back to Africa with the Russian connection. We don't have a lot of time. We have about 15 minutes. We can go slightly over if people want to stay with us, but I know it's late in some parts of the world. So what I'm going to do is read through as many of the questions as I can, and then just come back to each panelist for answer one or two of them maximum. You can choose which ones you want to answer. So the first one was from Nombulelo in the Eastern Cape, who said, regarding the African policy and governance, what practical steps can African governments take to strengthen the protection of nuclear facilities despite limited resources? Isabel did start answering that. So the other question was from Kudakwashe Mapako. Sorry for butchering that. Considering the shortcomings of the application and enforcement of international law in the context of nuclear security in a conflict environment, how do you envision the complementarity of international humanitarian law and nuclear security to secure comprehensive physical protection in armed conflict environments? So how does international law and nuclear safety come together? A comment from Arina Murasan. I really enjoyed Elena's presentation. The test for nuclear power is the strength of institutions as much as it is engineering. So there was a comment, and there was a response from Olena. Thank you. Martin Zupko, my friend in Europe. Do we know a fuel replacement schedule for Ukrainian nuclear power plants? This is a complex procedure, and repeatedly instability in electricity generation could create unexpected complications. Such a period may therefore be one in which all relevant parties, Russia, Ukraine, the US, the EU, Rosatom, and the IAEA, would need to reach agreement on how to conduct the fuel replacement safely. Email's coming in. Blocking this process might be another potential disaster. And then Zvinka did make an attempt to answer that one. William Bruno says, has there been any consequences, however mild, from the IAEA or other EU institutions on aggressive countries? Zvinka also made an attempt to answer that. And then there were a couple of open questions. A long comment from William I won't be able to read out, but he said, Olena's discussion about the ongoing frequent unplanned power out fluctuations worries me. The reckless throttling of output power was a significant contributor to the Chernobyl disaster. Absolutely. Letabo says, seeing that the bigger and richer countries in the recent war have demonstrated a general disregard of war crimes, how can we realistically enforce more stringent regulations around nuclear targets that can be enforced if they come into existence? Matu Nkube says, as artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies become increasingly integrated into nuclear systems and infrastructure, what role should the IAEA play in developing regulatory frameworks and safeguards to ensure nuclear safety and security? And then Martin asks Sam, what's your take on the latest comments by Alexei Likachev regarding the third wave of possible evacuations from Iran's Bushehr plant due to security concerns? Do you think Iran, the US, and Israel could agree to omit it from potential attacks? Another question to Sam from William. While Rosatom isn't directly sanctioned, do we see or expect supply chain bottlenecks under the current sanctions regime? And two more from Loiso Silwana. Nuclear facilities vulnerability in Africa is not only to be considered in a conventional war from one country to another. So what about all the civil conflicts that we see in our continent? And how would that affect nuclear safety? And could it be that the IAEA problem is more a lack of stringent follow-up or implementation of policies that are already made? That's from Mandi. Thank you for all those questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to go in the order of the speakers, and we'll start with Isabel. Please be brief and give your fellow panelists the opportunity to answer questions. Isabel.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So I've been typing some answers to some of the questions. I only managed to post answers to, or an answer to one of them so far. So I'll touch on Kudakwashi's question about this kind of compatibility of international humanitarian law and nuclear security. And I think it's important here to highlight that even in the discussion around nuclear weapons, the reason that we have the conference on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons is because this is a humanitarian issue. We've seen with Chernobyl, we've seen with Fukushima, the environmental consequences are absolutely devastating, and the real lived consequences for human beings as devastating as well. So we cannot separate humanitarian law from this issue. But because there's not a treaty law to supplement it, it's not even a matter of does it complement. It will, because the issue is the same. It should not be attacked. So even in treaty law, that is expressed. But it should supplement, because treaty law will automatically, in my view, reinforce the customary law, humanitarian law. Because if under attack, let's say the absolute worst case scenarios, that radioactive material leaks, we know what the consequences are going to be, and it will be a humanitarian, absolute humanitarian disaster. So I will leave that as an answer to that question. And then there were some other questions that I thought were quite interesting and thought-provoking. One on the consequences for aggressor countries. So there are examples also from the 80s when, for example, a nuclear installation under construction in Iraq was destroyed. There was a UN Security Council resolution adopted on that. But I think William kind of says it in his question, have there been any consequences, however mild? It is generally mild. It's international condemnation or a resolution adopted, whether it be in the IAEA General Conference or it be in the UN Security Council. But it's hard to punish states, as we keep seeing repeatedly throughout our history. And then there was also a question touching a little bit on enforcement. And I think that's the key question, is how do we enforce international law? That's a question that we keep grappling with, and I think now it's becoming more difficult to answer. But I think a potential answer to that could possibly lie in a reform of the multilateral system. We've seen how hard it is to even adopt crucial resolutions sometimes because of the veto, for example. We've seen how hard that makes enforcing certain international legal mechanisms. So I think that question also links to how do we make the international system, how do we make the multilateral system that we have that's meant to govern us, how do we make that more just? So I'm going to leave that there and allow space for other panelists.
Thank you. Lest we forget, we don't have a world government and a world police force and a world army to enforce these things. And unfortunately, it seems that international law is very ignorable. Zvínka, you want to tackle some of those questions?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to all panelists for your contributions. I think it really shows us that nuclear safety theoretically is within the responsibility of individual states. And then those individual states can choose whether to comply to UN Charter and follow non-violence principles of sovereignty principle or territorial integrity principle. Those are really interconnected into the whole idea of potential nuclear safety. In my personal experience, the accident on the Chernobyl power plant caused contaminations on different continents, including West Africa and in very distant parts of Europe and other parts of the world. The same with Fukushima. So while the responsibility for nuclear safety is within individual states, and IAEA only has recommendation role to play. So they provide recommendations, including to South Africa and to Ukraine or to any other state. They cannot require that those implementations are actually followed. And we know that some of those recommendations are not implemented in many countries for decades because it's only individual state that makes decisions about what is happening with the nuclear facility. So now, if we go further, if it's responsibility of the state, then who the state is responsible to and who holds the state accountable. And here we come to the role of civil society in those countries where such institution exists, or maybe other institutions that hold government responsible for that nuclear safety. In South Africa and in Ukraine, civil society groups play a critical role in keeping in check nuclear power authorities and also ensuring that the licensing is done properly, maybe not always successful, but we can see how much effort civil society takes. But if we come to the larger international system, it obviously tells us that currently under this international disorder, the nuclear safety principles and security principles are not working, similar to other principles of non-violence, sovereignty, or territorial integrity. And in case of Ukraine, they are very, very tightly connected. So it does leave us with the feeling that nuclear technology, under current circumstances, where governments can make those decisions on behalf of the whole planet, individual governments, leaves us all unsafe.
Thank you, Zvínka. Let's go to Olena.
Yes, I want to answer to William's comment about that power out fluctuations that caused the Chernobyl disaster. Maybe yes, this is sure an important point, and I am really glad that my presentation resonated. But it's worth to mention that Chernobyl used like a different type of reactors, RBMK and VVR reactors, which Ukraine operates today. They are like more stable under power transients, but more stable does not mean designed for this. Yes, repeated and unplanned this cycling still accumulates mechanical and thermal stress over time. It's not necessary to be a nuclear engineer, yes, to understand this. And the risk is not a sudden runaway reaction. It is more like gradual degradation of these safety margins. And what is worries me is that unlike Chernobyl, where we can identify like single event, single accident, yeah, this kind of cumulative risks is much harder to see, harder to measure, regulate, and harder to stop and to prevent. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we still have our presenters
Yes.
from Qatar with us? But next is Ambassador Pedro.
Yes. Well, in fact, of the questions, I have nothing else to add, frankly. Basically, I will just insist, and the question is not just to create new laws or new rules of international law, but to have the ones that we have complied by those that are the most powerful, and that's not happening. Thank you.
Thank you for being brief. I don't see our Qatari speakers, so I'm going to go to Sam. If our Qatari speakers are here, we'll end with you. But Sam, you had a couple of particular questions. Just unmute.
Yeah, with regards to Bushehr and the Iran issue, yeah, definitely. Likachev has become kind of a big, pronounced spokesperson for nuclear safety these days, in light of the attack on Iran, which is kind of ironic given Russia's own brinkmanship over the Zaporizhzhya nuclear plant. But yeah, basically what the Russians are trying to do over there is they're trying to make the U.S. and Israel treat Bushehr as what they call a safety island or a DMZ. And they're worried that, they obviously have the coordinates of the site and they could strike it, but equally they have enough coordination and surveillance over the site that they could actually sidestep a major attack that has spillovers or do something that would actually destroy the construction units. So I think that this is just basically Russia trying to protect its core facility there. It's also something that, it's invested in very heavily for a long time, right? Even though this original facility was actually devised during the Shah era, and German engineers helped build it. Bushehr has been inextricably linked to the Russia-Iran relationship since the 1990s, and Russian technicians work on the ground. They help and were involved in what they claim is civilian enrichment over there. And the other thing that Russia's been trying to do is been trying to showcase itself as a spokesperson for the safety of its own personnel and also for the people who work with them, relocating vulnerable staff to third countries like Armenia, taking care of people. So this is kind of a way for Russia to kind of present itself as a responsible stakeholder in the nuclear governance space, and also kind of present a more of a humanitarian face towards its own personnel, given its own history of abuses in that area. But it's also a critique that resonates pretty widely across the international community of the U.S. and Israel's brinkmanship against nuclear facilities. I don't think that Russian diplomacy and Russian rhetoric will do much about that. It's going to really depend on, obviously, what the U.S. and Iran decide with regards to the Strait of Hormuz, and whether Israel's seemingly greater risk appetite when it comes to striking energy facilities, like we've seen in South Pars, is reined in by the United States beforehand and not just after the fact when Trump criticized it on True Social the day later. With regards to supply chain bottlenecks in Rosatom, quite briefly, I think that, yes, obviously there are secondary impacts that cause significant challenges, right? For example, a lot of Russia's infrastructure from Rosatom that has come through partnerships with European companies like Siemens, right? So the Akkuyu nuclear plant in Turkey had a Siemens, Rosatom, Turkish kind of supply chain triangle. With Siemens out of the game, there was a clear supply chain disruption, and there was also funding issues that were affecting Akkuyu. And suddenly their star project in Turkey got derailed. They managed to get some Chinese turbine and generator parts coming in. They managed to use third countries to purchase equipment in Chinese yuan. It's interesting to watch what Russia's doing with Bangladesh in this regard. It's kind of a sanctions evasion tactic from everybody now, seemingly from nuclear energy to Dubai real estate. Seems to be having Bangladeshi connections. That's a long story. I've worked on that. But in general, yeah, there's a lot of problems with regards to delays in projects. And the shift to Chinese suppliers is not really very even. Getting the de-dollarization payment structures are a little bit difficult. So far, obviously, those problems seem to be impacting projects outside of Africa. They seem to be having more of a problem with Rupert in Bangladesh or Akuyu in Turkey, but I could easily see them hitting eventually El Daba and other projects in Africa, even though the Egyptians are saying, as of late 2025, that there are 30,000 workers on the ground and the project is on track for now. So I do see longer term issues, and also the Russians potentially using African theaters as secondary sanctions violators. Well, what does that mean for governance, and what does that mean for their own relationships with the United States and secondary sanctions? So yeah, there's a lot of obviously moving parts that would be vulnerable, but so far Rosatom's problems seem to be more featured in the sanctions space elsewhere, not in Africa.
Thank you, Sam. Do we have our Qatari speakers, or are they already offline? I don't see them on the presenters. So, Zvika, do you know?
I think they're offline.
Okay, they're offline. Not a problem. That means that we can actually finish on time. I just want to thank all the speakers from all around the world and everybody who watched. This will be available on SAIA's YouTube channel. So if you just search for SAIIA, it will be available on the YouTube channel. I think this is a very important discussion. If any of your colleagues were not able to join us live, it would be really great for them to pick up the discussion on online. And then, Zvinka, are you going to post where we can find the paper?
So the paper will be posted at the SAIA webpage, CST webpage, and also the Ukrainian Association and Dixie web pages. So there will be currently English translation, but we also will shortly post French and Arabic translations.
Great. Thank you very, very much, everybody. This was a really enlightening, scary, sobering discussion. Let's hope that we don't have to have this discussion in 6 months or 12 months' time, and things will look better for everybody. So thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.